registering into the live and seeing if anybody had a chance to tune in yet before we start. And I look forward to getting started and obviously talk about some of the questions that has been sent in this week. I got 2 questions that I want to answer, so it might be a short live today. And then I'll just go over a few tips. I've written down the questions that came in, which is obviously about cluster B personality disorders. So people primarily with narcissism and also borderline personality disorder are where the majority of questions I get. So let's get started. So the first question I got is, why are breakups so emotionally violent when you're dealing with somebody with borderline or narcissism? And I think the question to that, I'll give you a little bit of scientific background and then also a more simple explanation. So the reason these breakups tend to be so excessively violent is because they lack emotional regulation. And one of the things that distinguish a child from an adult is emotional regulation. So we have something it's our prefrontal cortex, the frontal part of your brain, which allow us to inhibit our emotional impulses, and it start develop from around the age of 8 until about the mid-20s. This part of our brain is fully developed, and that's what allows us to, self-reflect, to calm down. Cluster B personality disorders, because of developmental trauma that they had, their brain did not develop this function of the prefrontal cortex that allowed them to inhibit their emotional responses. And this is why when they become dysregulated, which we often refer to as narcissistic rage, or for the borderline, when they become dysregulated, they simply cannot manage and regulate their response. And that's why these discards or breakups normally are so excessively violent. So that was the answer to the first question that have come in about why these breakups are normally so extreme. And I say the other answer to this, besides the lack of emotional regulation that they struggle with, is also the fact that they have enormous excessive amount of shame. So narcissists are often people that have been severely shamed, and again, borderlines often live with an enormous amount of shame, and that is why they cannot take responsibility for their actions, and they therefore need to project that onto you, which often come out in very violent and extreme ways, because you become the object of that discomfort, of that pain that they're feeling from that shame. And like I said, it's why they can acknowledge when they've done something wrong. So the other question I got all the questions lined up here on my computer, which was, are we just an object? And it's a really good question, and I think it's one of the things that are very difficult to come to terms with after a breakup with somebody with borderline personality disorder, narcissism, or any cluster B personality disorder. It could also be histrionic or sociopsychopath. And the answer is yes, you are an object. And to try and imagine and comprehend how the narcissist sees you and experiencing you, because it's very different to how you relate, because they don't attach, they don't have empathy, which is also why they can't attach, is the fact that imagine that you're eating a sandwich. You get this sandwich, you start eating it, and it doesn't taste that great. And you know what? You decide to just throw it out and buy another sandwich. You don't feel bad about that. You don't grieve that, right? Or if you finish a sandwich, you throw out the packaging, and then later when you're hungry, you get a new sandwich, because to the narcissist you're a supply, and you fulfilled that supply, which as this example for you is hunger. And when that's fulfilled, then they don't need you anymore. Or if you don't fulfill that supply that they need fully, then they can just discard you. So yes, you are an object, which is why often it leaves this shock on the people who obviously are survivors of narcissistic abuse, because they discard you so quickly, so ruthlessly, like you just throwing out a sandwich, because that's essentially what you are. And I think for the borderline it's slightly different, but yes, you're still an object, which is why you still have this extreme experience when you get discarded. And for the borderline, it's purely the fact that they create a fantasy, which we also refer to as idolization. So they need to create a fantasy in their mind that you're this ideal, because they also lack a sense of identity. So to feel a sense of safety, they need to have a rescuer, and you become that, who fulfill that they feel can maybe relieve this pain that they are constantly living with. Borderline personality is a devastating mental health condition, and also the mental health condition most correlated with high suicide rate, and it also correlates with childhood abuse. So it is a developmental trauma that we have to understand, and therefore they need to objectify you as a fantasy, which again is also what we refer to as idolization, which is where you get the love bombing, the affection, the intense focus on you very quickly, where everything you do is amazing, the shows of affection really, really quickly. It has nothing to do with you, because the truth is nobody knows who you are after having met you, dated you for a short while. So if anybody ever do this to you and start complimenting you highly really, really quickly, you need to understand that you're dealing with somebody who's living in a fantasy world. Even if they don't have a personality disorder, this is a warning sign of somebody who is dysregulated and is not stable. We all idolize to some extent. It's normal to, get excited when somebody fulfill all our, ideals of what we think we are looking for. And then we all start creating fantasies, but people with anxious attachments tend to do this more. And people with borderline personality disorder live at the extreme range of anxious attachment. So yes, the short answer is you are also to some extent an object of their fantasy. And this is also why when the splitting happens, they go from idolizing you to painting you black. And suddenly they can turn and it becomes very uncomfortable. And a lot of people, of course, who write to me report the abuse that they have been subject to because of this. And when they split you black, they also feel justified treating you in this way because they actually feel that they're the one who has been violated, who've been done wrong. So yeah, when you see it from that experience, they feel that it's okay to not treat you well. So yeah, these are the two questions, as I said, I wanted to address today. I want to keep it pretty short, this live, so it doesn't drag out. I wanted to give a few tips here that I wrote down on how to date safely after having been in a toxic relationship. And again, I also just want to mention a toxic relationship doesn't have to be with somebody who had a cluster B personality disorders. Even two very healthy, functional, wonderful human beings can inherently be toxic with each other when they're together. And often that comes down to people's lack of awareness around their attachment styles and what they need to feel safe. Because at the very core of relating to other human beings is our need for safety. And again, people say, yeah, well, what does that mean? Safety mean, and if you think back to any of us who might have been lucky enough to have a good childhood with a mother or a father or a caregiver who were responsive, then safety is attunement and responsiveness. So if you think again back to the mother, when the child comes out of the womb, then you start crying. The mother tried to attune and figure out, do you need food? Do you need water? Do you need sleep? And then hopefully the mother also responds to that by then giving you what you need. And as you get this consistently over time, you start feeling safe. However, this need stays with us from we are born until we die, even though we have this idea of individualization, which is so popular in our culture, and to some extent is a lot of nonsense that are not doing us any favors. The fact is we do need each other. We are social beings, and the first thing to understand in a relationship is really what the core safety needs are of you and the person that you're relating to, whether there's a friendship, a partnership, romantic relationship, doesn't matter. It's the same core function of human experience. The relationship can simply turn toxic because people go into a toxic dance because they don't understand the other person. A classical, easy example to give is when the avoidant attached and the anxious attached come together. The avoidant often needs space because they have learned that they can't trust caregivers to respond. So they learn to look out for their own needs. And they learn to tune in and self-soothe. So they often need space. They often are afraid of intimacy for a good reason. They learn that when they open up and ask for help or cried out, their parents would not respond. So why would they dare to open up if you anticipate that nobody will respond anyway? So therefore their strategy is to retrieve and take care of themselves and trust themselves. That's the avoidant. The anxious is the opposite. They have developed a strategy as a child where they fear abandonment, fear being left, fear not being responded to. But their strategy for trying to get a response and feel safe is to latch out, to try and control, which is why they need a lot of reassurance, etc. And when these two come together, even two wonderful human beings that are not even toxic, then they can become toxic, the dynamic, because as the anxious try and reach out to get reassurance, the avoidant will feel overwhelmed and controlled and pull back, which makes the anxious more anxious and attack more and try and control more, and the avoidant pull back more. And so the negative cycle, the toxic dance continues. And this is often where people go into therapy when they don't understand why things are not working. And at the core of these dysfunctions are normally a misunderstanding about the underlying safety needs. So I just wanted to address on that. So basically, to talk more about, again, what do we need to feel safe when dating? The number one thing to do, and especially if you've been in a toxic relationship, because toxic people with cluster B personality disorder, the narcissist, borderline, histrionic, social psychopath, tend to target people with the anxious attachment style. They tend to target the caretakers of this world. They tend to target the people who are people pleasers, who prioritize other people's needs for obvious reason. Number one, if you prioritize other people's needs, that works great for the narcissist because they want everything to be about them. So that makes you a target. And again, if you lack boundaries, then it's obviously easier to manipulate you and also violate you. And again, make it all about them. So therefore, there's even, I've spoken to narcissists who described how they have specific methods of how they test and select the people that they target. They will see whether you get up and give your chair to somebody else who needs it. They will see consistently if you prioritize other people's needs. And when they spot this, they know you're a good target. So therefore, it's really inherent and imperative to learn to have assertive boundaries and knowing yourself and get comfortable expressing them. And again, you can work on this in therapy. You can work on this with, say, friends. There's a lot of simple embodied exercises you can do to develop your boundaries. One thing I often do and encourage people to do with a trusted friend or family member is learning to control their physical space. And also just physically learning to say no becomes a very empowering experience for people who struggle with boundaries. So you can do something simple where you stand facing each other, and one person's task is simply to notice their own bodily sensations and when something doesn't feel right. And again, you might get the need to caretake and think, oh, I don't want to make the other person feel bad. But in this exercise, your role is only to stay present with self and act on what feels right for you. And have the other person slowly walk towards you as you now sense into when it feels too close. As soon as it does, say stop and make it physically, because there's something really important about telling your body somatically that this is a boundary and you're enforcing that. Then you can tell them to move back a bit further, find where it feels good and safe in your body. And as you practice this, you start to learn, one, how does it feel in your body, first of all, when you don't feel safe? Because often we are so out of tune with our body, we don't even know when somebody's violating our boundaries. But when you learn to tune in doing these exercises, you start learning and knowing, this is how it feels. I know that when my body and my stomach contract, when my jaws get tense, it means my boundaries are being violated. Knowing that, I have very early cues to be able to attune and know when I'm being violated and therefore being able to stop it. So this is a great exercise that you can do to try and practice your boundary. Make sure you do it with somebody you feel safe with already. The other one is, of course, being aware that you idolize too. As I said, we all do this. And people with anxious attachment tend to idolize more than others. So we see traits that we like, and then we start creating this fantasy of who this person is and that they're the perfect partner. Because with anxious attachment, we tend to want quick intensity too, because it makes us feel safe. So we often want things to move quick. We often put in a lot of effort to make the relationship work very quickly. And we like the quick intensity, which is why we are very receptive to the narcissist and borderlines, etc., their love bombing, because it gives us that sense of identity, of intensity that we crave so badly. But it's a huge danger for us to go quick. So slow down and remind yourself that all these fantasies you're having, oh, this is such a wonderful person, are just a fantasy. You don't know who somebody is at all when you dated them for a couple of months or a couple of times. It takes consistency over time to have any idea. It takes seeing people in different environments to know who they are. You need to have conflict before you have any idea who you're dealing with. Because one of the core things about knowing whether you're dealing with a toxic person or not is see how they deal with conflict, how they deal with being exposed to one of your boundaries. So a great way to quickly test whether you're dealing with a toxic person or not is to set a conscious boundary on purpose. A person who is healthy would acknowledge your boundaries, they would respond to it, they might even apologize, and they would make amends and change behavior to not violate your boundary again. A toxic person will try and make you feel guilty, make you feel that you're in the wrong, or even outright just ignore your boundary. So this is absolutely critically, is to recognize your own idolization and remind yourself to slow down when you have the tendency to believe this. Remind yourself you don't know this person, okay? Slowing down is your best defense in general against making poor choices. So we have this idea of chemistry in our culture, which has been glorified by Hollywood, where we think, oh, it's right when it feels right. No, this is why you're so easy to manipulate, especially with anxious attachment. This is where the narcissist, borderline, etc. use love bombing to quickly make you feel that intensity. They use mirroring to to make you feel that they are what you're looking for, that they have the same values, same interests. They use future pacing to talk about the future, so you start fantasizing and become emotionally invested in that. They use emotional dumping to throw all their traumas on you. Again, as a caretaker, often with anxious attachment and people pleaser, you want to help and take care because you learn that made you feel valuable. So again, understanding the difference between emotional dumping and vulnerability is also critical for you if you have this anxious attachment that gets sucked in by toxic personality disorders. Because emotional dumping is somebody on the third date telling you about all their traumas, all the horrible things that they happened to you, while vulnerability is a slow disclosure and opening over time as somebody earns your trust. It's like a flower that slowly opens up. And vulnerability is organic, with trust built over time as you disclose more and more. This is a requirement for intimacy and a beautiful thing. But emotional dumping is not. Emotional dumping is somebody who discloses all their trauma very fast because they want you to hold their trauma for them. And that's very, very different than vulnerability. Vulnerability doesn't require where you ask the other person to hold it for you. It's an expression, an opening of who you are to somebody who's earned your trust. So I hope that makes a clear distinction. Anyone who quickly discloses lots of horrible things that happen to them, again, is a huge warning sign that where you should back up and remind yourself, even though you might have a tendency to want to caretake, this is an adult relationship. Okay, and one of the key distinct differences between a child and an adult relationship, where there's not mutuality and there's not supposed to be mutuality, because your child might violate your boundaries, call you an idiot when you don't give them that ice cream, you still love them, you're still there for them, even if they do that repeatedly, because they're your child. You look out for their needs, you don't expect them to look out for your needs. There's a complete lack of mutuality, and that's okay when it's your child. But in an adult relationship, there needs to be mutuality. That's one of the core principles of a healthy relationship. Mutuality doesn't mean we keep count on who paid the last bill, or I gave you a massage, now you gave me a massage. Keeping count is not mutuality. What I mean by mutuality is a mutual care for each other's needs and a mutual respect for each other's boundaries. And if that's not there, then it's not a healthy dynamic. And it's not sustainable over long periods of time, because one partner will drain the other and resentment will eventually build up. So while it might feel good for you initially that you can caretake this person and feel you have a role in that, in your identity, then over time it ends up draining you, which again, will people report when they've been with a narcissist, with a borderline, with a histrionic, or even worse, with a social psychopath. So I wanted to just address that. And again, we talked about why it's so appealing. I wrote down a few of the points I want to discuss here. So just remember, love is slow. It's consistent attunement and responsiveness to your needs over time. And also seeing how somebody repairs. As I said, having conflict is important before you commit to anyone, because often we can all be good when we are getting along, when we're dating, it's fun, we share the same interest. But when you have conflict is when you see the true strength of a relationship. And a toxic person is not able to do this. In a healthy relationship, conflict is met with repair, meaning two people who turn towards each other, who try to understand each other's world and who accept responsibility for their part, because we always have a part. Both people have the ability to self-reflect. Okay, both people have an ability to show that they change behavior, to not encounter the same issue again and again and again. This is a defining feature. So the ability to repair and turn towards each other by both people is an essential, critical thing. So again, don't commit to somebody until you had some kind of tension, conflict with them, and see how they're able to deal with conflict. Really, really important. And if you're going to spend your time with this person, what is a rush? Because the only reason you're rushing into this idea of chemistry that we've been sold on is because we have a sense of anxious attachment, and it gives us a sense of safety. And your sense of safety is a very valid need, but instead maybe you could identify that you need to feel safe and find other ways to get it than to rushing into relationship. This could be by having safe, secure attachments with friends that are responsive to your needs as well. So maybe you don't need to rush so quickly in, because that need is already fulfilled. Because the need for safety is totally valid. It's just the way we often tend to fulfill that need when we're anxiously attached is not beneficial, and actually end up deepening that old developmental trauma wound that we have, because we get inconsistency and it reinforces the narrative. It's like we're replaying the same movie again and again, just with different characters in it. So to stop that, The idea is not, and I know a lot of people talk about self-love, and yes, it had its place, but I'm also a big critic of this whole movement, purely because if we actually understand the neurology of the brain, we know that we are social beings. And actually acknowledging and accepting that we need others is a huge freedom, and it's also the truth we do. From we are born to the day they die, we need others, we need secure attachment, we need collaboration. It's how we flourish. A more than 70 years study from Harvard University clarified that the only lifelong factor that was consistent in our happiness was our quality of the social bond we have with others, and particular secure attachment. So I just wanted to touch on that. Again, I think another thing to think about when you go out and date again after having had a toxic relationship is that our brain tend to make presumptions, and we tend to ruminate about why people act in certain ways, which is also why it's often so difficult for us with anxious attachment when we leave someone, a toxic partner, is we want to know the why. The rumination of anxious attachment is very typical. And because we need to make meaning, we tend to make presumptions. So when you go out and date again, you might have somebody who does not respond to you, which is a very common thing. And again, what might happen when you don't get a response, your brain wants to make meaning out of this. So you start projecting all these ideas of why this person might not be responsive. And these are your old stories being projected. You have no idea why this person is not responsive to you. It could be simply because they were too busy. It could be their mom got sick. The fact is, a lot of pain is created by us buying into these presumptions that often are very negative when we have an anxious attachment, because we tend to believe that we are being abandoned. We simply don't know. So just acknowledge these stories. You can hear them, you can write them out in your journal, and just remember that they're not real. We don't know why people act the way they do, which brings me to the next point, because one of the reasons we get stuck in the why, or why people act a certain way, is because we have lost touch with ourselves and what we need and what our boundaries actually are. Because the fact is, once we know our own needs and our own boundaries, the why is not very important anymore, because all that matters is, do people align with what I need? So to give you the example before, somebody, let's say I went on some dates and this person just stopped responding. Instead of being caught and thinking, why did she not respond? Or did she reject me? Did I say something wrong? Did somebody say something bad about me? And be stuck in rumination, which caused me a lot of distress, which is typical of anxious attachment. Instead, if I come back to myself and focus on what is I need people that are responsive to me and that respond in a reasonable time. And I need people who communicate well. So if they can't do that, that they at least let me know. So this is just not the way I want to relate. And now I no longer need to even focus on the why this person acted that way, because I already know it's not how I want to relate, and I can just let it go. So the more we can get back in touch, and again, it's typical for people with anxious attachment to not be in touch with their own needs and boundaries because they've been so over-focused on the external world and pleasing others, is what we call hypervigilant. So anxious attachment people that are often targeted by toxic dating partners tend to be really focused outwardly on what other people need, because that's how they learn to feel safe. And because they're hyper-focused on other people and the world around them, they lose touch with themselves, which is why things like yoga is a really good practice. Anything that brings you back in touch with your body, dancing, and start noticing what it is you need so you can express that clearly. Like I said, do the boundary exercise I gave you at the beginning of this live, so you can start noticing in your body, where does it feel? Where is that boundary? Because the fact is, often when we understand logically our boundary, it's too late. Because cognition, thought, logic is the last part of our three-part brain to come online. First, the somatic sensation, which is the first part that get activated when we have a stress response. The second part is the limbic system, our emotions. And the last part is cognition, which is delayed. So by the time you know something isn't right, it's often too late. So the way, as I explained in the beginning, to start getting in touch and being able to assert your boundaries is to get familiar with your bodily sensations when people start getting too close or crossing your boundaries. And you can use that exercise. So yeah, like I said, I wanted to keep this short. I think we've gone for 20-25 minutes now. And if you guys have any questions, then please send me the questions to Thomas, THOMAS, at Sensensa, ZENSENSA.com, and I will address them on the next live call that I do. So yeah, that's all for now, and I hope you guys enjoyed this. All the best.